Hello everyone, hope you're having a great day. Today we're going to explore a story about two lives moving forward on parallel paths. James, trapped in power and responsibility, and Tu Diep, learning resilience in a quiet wooden house among whispering bamboo. What happens when love remains but life forces separation? If you enjoy deep, emotional stories about sacrifice and impossible choices, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next videos. The iron gates swung open with a weight that felt heavier than their actual mass, as if the very metal understood the burden of what lay beyond. James stood at the threshold, his leather bag hanging from one shoulder, staring at the large house that had shaped his childhood yet now felt like a prison. The house rose before him with its white columns and pristine windows reflecting the afternoon sun, everything exactly as he remembered yet profoundly wrong. The air itself seemed different here, thinner somehow, lacking the warmth of the modest wooden home he had shared with Tu Diep and little Ly among the bamboo. His parents appeared at the top of the steps, his mother's hand pressed to her chest, his father standing tall and rigid as always. They descended together, and James could see the conflicting emotions playing across his mother's face: joy at her son's return, relief that he had finally chosen family duty, but also careful restraint, as if showing too much emotion might somehow break the fragile reconciliation. His father extended his hand first, a formal gesture that spoke volumes about the distance between them. James took it, felt the firm grip that had always demanded strength, never softness. His mother embraced him next, and he caught the faint scent of her perfume, expensive and French, so different from Tu Diep's simple jasmine soap. "Welcome home, son," his father said, and James wanted to tell him that home was somewhere else entirely, in a place where a little girl's laughter filled the rooms and where love didn't come with conditions. But he said nothing, simply nodded, because he had made his choice, and there was no turning back now. The first morning at the company arrived with the weight of inevitability. James stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive conference room, looking down at the city sprawling below. Behind him, the board members filed in, their shoes clicking against the polished floor with military precision. He turned to face them, these men and women who had known him since childhood, who now regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. They were wondering if he had what it took, if the years away had made him stronger or weaker, if the son would prove worthy of the father's empire. His father sat at the head of the table, not yielding the chairman's seat, despite James's new title as heir apparent. The old man's presence dominated the room without effort, decades of authority radiating from him. James took his designated seat, second from the head, close to power but not quite there, and felt the symbolic distance like a physical thing. The meeting began with financial reports, market analyses, expansion strategies. James listened, processed, understood the numbers with the education his father had paid dearly for. But as the discussion turned to labor negotiations, to cutting costs by reducing worker benefits, to maximizing profit margins regardless of human cost, he felt something inside him resist. He thought of the faces he had seen during his years away, the people who worked 3 jobs to feed their families. He thought of Tu Diep, who had never asked for luxury, only respect and dignity. When the CFO finished presenting a proposal to reduce overtime pay, James spoke for the first time. "What if we approach this differently?" His voice cut through the room's comfortable consensus. Heads turned. His father's eyes narrowed. James continued, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "What if instead of cutting benefits, we invested in our workers? Better training, better conditions, transparent compensation. Happy employees are productive employees. It's not weakness. It's smart business." The silence that followed was suffocating. His father leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, regarding James with the expression he had perfected over decades of boardroom battles. "You've been away too long," he said finally, his tone measured but with an edge sharp enough to cut. "You've forgotten how the real world works. Sentiment doesn't build empires, hard decisions do." James felt the familiar weight of his father's disapproval, the same feeling that had chased him throughout his childhood, that had driven him away in the first place. But something had changed. He had changed. "With respect, Father, I haven't forgotten the real world. I've lived in it. Really lived in it, not from the top floor of a skyscraper, but in the streets where our workers go home every night. And I've learned that you can be successful without being ruthless." The room held its collective breath. No one spoke to the chairman this way. His father's jaw tightened, and for a moment, James saw something flicker in the old man's eyes. Anger, yes, but also something else. Surprise, perhaps, or the faintest hint of respect. The meeting ended without resolution, but a line had been drawn between father and son, between two visions of what the company should be. That night, long after everyone else had gone home, James remained in his new office. It was enormous, decorated with understated luxury that cost more than most people's yearly salary. He sat in the darkness, not bothering to turn on the lights, watching the city glow below him. The financial reports lay spread across his desk, numbers and projections that represented real power, real influence. But all he could think about was Nye's face, the way she had looked at him the last morning, her small hands clinging to his neck, asking when he would come back. He had promised her soon, knowing it was a lie. He thought of Tu Diep, the woman who had taught him what love actually meant, who had never asked him to be anything other than himself, who had let him go because she understood that some cages are lined with silk, but are cages nonetheless. He had everything now: position, wealth, legacy. Why did it feel like he had nothing at all? The weeks passed, and gradually, imperceptibly, power began to shift. His father, perhaps exhausted by decades of corporate warfare, or perhaps genuinely impressed by James's conviction, despite disagreeing with his methods, began to step back. He still attended meetings, still offered his opinions, but he was no longer making every decision. James found himself with real authority, real ability to implement changes. He restructured departments, brought in new leadership that shared his vision, slowly, carefully, began transforming the company from the inside out. It was exhausting work, requiring political maneuvering and strategic thinking that drained him. Every decision was scrutinized, every change resisted. But he persisted, driven by a vision of what business could be if it balanced profit with humanity. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had gained the power to change things, but lost the freedom to simply be. He was the heir apparent now, but the crown was heavier than he had ever imagined. Meanwhile, far from the city's glass towers and concrete streets, in a small wooden house nestled within a bamboo grove, Tu Diep woke to silence, broken only by the whisper of bamboo leaves in the morning breeze. The bed beside her was empty, as it had been every morning since James left, and would be every morning hereafter. She lay still for a moment, allowing herself this brief vulnerability before the day demanded her strength. Through the wooden slats of the window, she could see the bamboo stalks swaying gently, their shadows dancing across the worn floorboards. Then she rose, because Nye would wake soon, and her daughter needed a mother who was whole, even if that wholeness was carefully constructed each morning like armor against the day. She moved through the small house, its wooden beams creaking familiarly beneath her feet, preparing breakfast on the simple stove, organizing Nye's school things, maintaining the routines that gave structure to their lives. Routine was salvation. Routine was what kept you moving forward when every instinct wanted to curl up and surrender to grief. She had learned this in the days following James's departure, when the silence in the wooden house had been so profound she could hear the bamboo creaking in the wind, each sound a reminder of solitude. The bamboo grove that surrounded their home had become both sanctuary and prison, beautiful in its serenity, isolating in its remoteness. James had loved this place, had said the sound of wind through bamboo was like nature breathing. Now that poetic observation felt like a ghost haunting every quiet moment. Ly appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her hair a wild tangle that Tu Diep would patiently brush out after breakfast. "Is Papa coming today?" she asked. The same question she had asked every morning for the first month, less frequently now, but still often enough to pierce Tu Diep's carefully maintained composure. She knelt down to her daughter's eye level, smoothing hair back from the small face that looked so much like James's. It sometimes hurt to look at her directly. "Not today, baby. Papa is working very hard at his important job, but he loves you very much even when he can't be here." Ly nodded, accepting this explanation with the resilience of children, though Tu Diep saw the shadow that passed across her daughter's face. She pulled Ly close, breathing in the scent of her hair, this perfect little person who was both a reminder of what she had lost and a reason to keep going. The days developed their own rhythm. Mornings were for Ly, breakfast, school preparation, the walk down the narrow path through the bamboo to the main road where the school bus would stop. Tu Diep would watch until the vehicle disappeared around the bend, then walk back through the grove, the bamboo closing around her like green curtains. Then came work, the journey into town to the community center where she coordinated programs for struggling families. The work was meaningful but exhausting, each family's story a reminder of life's fundamental unfairness. Her colleagues knew something had changed. She was quieter now, more focused, threw herself into work with an intensity that concerned them, but she deflected their gentle inquiries with smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes. Evenings meant the return journey, walking back up the path as dusk settled through the bamboo. Then dinner prepared on the wood stove, homework help at their small wooden table, bath time with water heated in kettles, stories read by lamplight. Then finally, after Ly slept, came the nights when she could sit on the wooden porch and let herself remember, the bamboo rustling its endless conversation in the darkness around her. There were moments when the weight became almost unbearable. Late at night, when exhaustion had stripped away her defenses, when the bills piled up and the wooden house felt too isolated, when Ly asked innocent questions about family that had no good answers, when the wind howled through the bamboo grove, making the small house feel like the last inhabited place on earth. In those moments, Tu Diep allowed herself to feel the full measure of her loss. She would sit on the porch in the darkness, wrapped in a blanket against the chill, hands pressed to her face, and let the tears come silently so as not to wake her daughter. The bamboo bore witness to her grief, swaying in sympathetic response, but she never let it consume her. She had made a promise to herself the day James left. She would not break. Not for her own sake, but for Ly's. Her daughter would not grow up watching her mother dissolve into bitterness or despair. She would see strength, resilience, would learn that women could survive anything, that love was not weakness, and that sacrifice was not the same as surrender. So Tu Diep wept when she needed to, then washed her face with cold water from the well, straightened her spine, and faced the next day. She did not try to contact James. This was perhaps the hardest part, the deliberate choice not to reach out, not to bridge the distance he had created. Her phone held his number, and sometimes late at night her thumb would hover over it, the temptation nearly overwhelming. But she always stopped, because she understood, even through her pain, that he had made an impossible choice, and she would not make it harder by pulling at the threads that held his resolve together. To contact him would be to question his decision, to make him doubt, to potentially destroy him with guilt. She loved him too much for that, so she kept her silence, her dignity, her boundaries. She let him go completely, cleanly, even though every cell in her body wanted to cling. This was love, too, the kind that didn't demand, didn't manipulate, didn't use emotion as a weapon, the kind that hurt like hell but felt honest in its pain. As months passed, something unexpected happened. Tu Diep began to discover parts of herself that had been dormant. Not that James had suppressed her. He had always encouraged her independence. But there was something about being forced to stand completely alone that revealed capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. She enrolled in evening classes in town, working toward a degree that would open more career opportunities, making the journey back to the bamboo house later and later, sometimes not arriving until the stars were bright overhead. She reconnected with old friends. She learned to fix things around the wooden house herself, patching the roof when rain found weaknesses, reinforcing the porch steps, maintaining the well pump. The bamboo grove itself became less haunting and more companionable. She learned its rhythms, understood its moods, found comfort in its constancy. She was not moving on. That suggested forgetting, and she would never forget James. But she was moving forward. There was a difference. Moving forward meant acknowledging that life continued, that there was purpose and meaning and even joy to be found despite loss. Across the city, James stood at his office window as he did most nights now, unable to go home to the empty house, unable to stop thinking about the family he had abandoned for duty. The company was transforming under his leadership, slowly but undeniably. Worker satisfaction was up. Profits, contrary to his father's predictions, were steady and even growing. The business press had started writing about his revolutionary approach. Though he found the term ridiculous, there was nothing revolutionary about treating people decently. His father watched all this with an expression James couldn't quite read. Pride, resentment, acceptance, perhaps all three. They rarely spoke of personal matters anymore, their relationship reduced to business discussions and the occasional family dinner that felt like a corporate obligation. James thought about Tu Diep and Ly every single day. He wondered what Ly was learning in school, whether she still asked for him, if she was forgetting his face. He wondered if Tu Diep was okay in that small wooden house in the bamboo grove, if she had enough firewood for the stove, if the isolation was too much, if she felt safe there alone with their daughter. The thought of them in that remote place, so far from help if they needed it, filled him with protective instinct that had nowhere to go, no action to take. He could have found out easily. He had the resources to know everything about their lives if he wanted, but he restrained himself. To watch them from afar would be selfish, would satisfy his need while potentially disturbing their peace. So he lived with uncertainty, with imagination that was probably worse than reality, with the constant ache of absence. How could he feel anything for anyone else when his heart was elsewhere, in a wooden house among bamboo, with two people who had taught him what actually mattered? Sometimes, in the deep hours of night when sleep eluded him, James questioned everything. Had he made the right choice? Could there have been another way? Should he have fought harder to keep both worlds? These questions circled endlessly, and he never found satisfying answers. The truth was complex and uncomfortable. His choice had been both right and wrong, necessary and devastating, the best option among terrible alternatives. He was doing good work now, changing lives on a scale he could never have achieved before. Workers had better conditions because of him. Families had more security. This mattered. This had value. But did it equal the value of being present for his daughter's childhood? Did it compensate for the woman he loved facing every challenge alone? The scale would never balance, no matter how he tried to tip it. On a gray afternoon that felt like any other, James found himself driving out of the city, telling himself he was just taking a drive, clearing his head, that it meant nothing. But his car navigated toward the road that led to the bamboo grove, his hands on the wheel seeming to move of their own volition. He drove slowly as he neared the area, his eyes scanning the green wall of bamboo on either side of the road, looking for the narrow path he remembered. He didn't turn down it. He didn't dare go that far, didn't trust himself to see the house and not stop. But just being near, just knowing they were somewhere within that rustling green sanctuary, brought both comfort and agony. He sat in his parked car for a moment, windows down, listening to the wind move through millions of bamboo leaves, the same wind that was probably touching Tu Diep's face at that very moment. Then he drove away before his resolve could weaken, before he could do something stupid and selfish that would complicate their healing. Back at the office, he threw himself into work with renewed intensity, using spreadsheets and strategy sessions as armor against feeling. In her wooden house among the bamboo, Tu Diep prepared dinner for Ly, who was chattering about her day at school, about the friends she had made, about the art project that had earned her teacher's praise. Tu Diep listened with full attention, asking questions, laughing at the funny parts, being present in the way that children needed and deserved. After dinner, after homework at their wooden table worn smooth by use, after bath and bedtime stories read by the warm glow of lamplight, she sat alone on the porch. The night sounds of the bamboo grove surrounded her, the rustle of leaves, the creak of stalks, the occasional call of a nightbird. She thought about James, as she did every night, wondered if he was happy, if he ever thought of them, if the sacrifice had been worth it. She didn't know that at that very moment, he was sitting in his office thinking of her, that their thoughts were reaching toward each other across the distance like invisible threads that could never quite touch. They existed in parallel now, two lives that had been intimately intertwined now running along separate tracks, heading toward different destinations, but forever marked by their intersection. The city spread out below James's office window, a million lights representing a million lives, each person carrying their own burdens, making their own impossible choices. He was one among millions, not special, not unique in his suffering. This thought brought odd comfort. He was not alone in being alone. Somewhere beyond the city lights, in a bamboo grove where darkness was deeper and stars were brighter, Tu Diep was putting their daughter to bed, maybe sitting on her wooden porch, maybe looking up at this same sky. They were breathing the same air, living under the same moon, connected by invisible bonds that neither time nor distance could fully sever. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was what they had. And so it would have to be everything. In her wooden house nestled in the bamboo grove, Tu Diep closed the shutters and turned from the window. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new small victories, new moments of both sorrow and strength. She would face them as she had faced every day since James left, with grace, with dignity, with the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself but simply persists. Ly would wake to the sound of wind in bamboo, and the day would begin again, the rhythm continuing, life flowing forward like a river that cannot be stopped or reversed, only navigated. She was learning to navigate. They both were, in their separate streams, moving through time toward unknown futures, carrying each other in memory and heart, even as physical distance kept them apart. James closed his laptop and prepared to leave the office, though home was just another kind of office, another place where he performed the role expected of him. In the elevator descending from his tower, he caught his reflection in the polished metal doors, a successful man in an expensive suit, expression controlled. He looked like his father. The thought disturbed him more than it should have, but behind that controlled expression, behind the mask he had learned to wear, the real James remained. The man who had loved freely, who had chosen differently once, who still carried that love like a light in darkness, even if no one else could see it. That man was still there. That love was still there, running parallel to his public life like an underground river, hidden but never dry. And so they continued, James in his world of power and responsibility, Tu Diep in her world of resilience and daily courage among the whispering bamboo, two parallel lines that geometry promised would never meet again. But geometry didn't account for the heart, didn't measure the weight of memory or the strength of love that persisted despite impossibility. They were separate now, living different stories, but those stories had been written in the same book, their chapters intertwined in ways that could never be fully undone. He stood in his conference room, surrounded by people who needed his decisions. She stood in her small wooden kitchen, surrounded by the simple evidence of the life she was building, the bamboo rustling its eternal song outside her window. Both were moving forward, both were surviving, both were carrying wounds that would never fully heal, but had learned to function despite the pain. This was not the ending they had wanted, not the story they had hoped to write, but it was their story now, and they would live it with whatever grace and courage they could muster. Two parallel lives flowing through time, separate but forever, invisibly, connected by the love they had shared and the sacrifice it had required. James returns to his family's empire, stepping into power while leaving behind the quiet life he shared with Tu Diep and their daughter Ly. At the company, he challenges his father's ruthless vision, trying to prove that profit and humanity can coexist. Success slowly comes, but it costs him freedom, warmth, and a sense of home. Far away, Tu Diep builds a resilient life in a small wooden house among bamboo, raising Ly with patience, routine, and silent strength. She carries her grief without bitterness, choosing dignity over dependence. Both move forward on separate paths, bound by memory and sacrifice. Though distance keeps them apart, love remains an invisible thread, shaping who they become, reminding them that some choices change everything, and some connections never truly disappear. Time passes quietly, testing resolve, deepening wounds, while hope survives in small moments.